The Black church is this reference historically to that subset of African American Christianity that has been on the side of the fight for freedom, justice, and equality.
There's a rich history and heritage to these African American churches.
It was the center of our existence.
The church was a place where all of the adults played a role in your development.
The church is not just a place where people go, it's a focal point of the activity. And it's where you let down your guard.
So where is the Black church using that term in terms of LGBT issues?
The Black church has been the cornerstone of our community for generations. Since the days of slavery, the Black church has been a source of survival and hope and the catalyst for social change, not only for the Black community, but for the entire country. The Black church served as the headquarters for the civil rights movement, producing prolific leaders like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and queer activist, lawyer, and Episcopal priest Pauli Murray. For generations, the Black church has served as the conscience of America. For too long, however, Black LGBTQ people of faith have sat in the shadows in some communities, fighting to stay true to their faith without sacrificing their identities. Black LGBTQ people of faith have served their churches, their synagogues, and their mosques with distinction, even at times in communities that did not affirm their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. We need to do more to address the challenges that I and many of my fellow Black LGBTQ community members have experienced at the intersections of our faith and our identities. This challenge is not unique to the Black community. It is important that we work together to affirm the full dignity and humanity of all LGBTQ people in faith communities and in the public square. Sometimes the work we do as LGBTQ advocates in faith communities can feel insurmountable. But we cannot get anywhere without taking action. This is why it is important for us to engage in conversations about the issues that we face. By bringing our struggle out of the shadows and into the light, we can do what Dr. King promised would be possible and draw a stone of hope out of a mountain of despair.
I was born to a family where my father was a minister and my mother was a church musician. So I was at church all the time. I literally just grew up right there inside the church. So though it's very much a part of my being, I don't attend church anymore. The life that I knew is no longer true. I visit some churches. I visit churches with my mom. I tried, I think, when I first had kids to find a church that would fit my husband and me. And then I never really found a place that I thought was comfortable. And part of that was because I was growing and changing. And then over time, I compounded that issue with the fact that we understood that our child was transgender.
The Black church was really the only place where slaves, recently freed slaves, Black people in general, would be allowed to hold leadership positions, hold leadership roles. That was the epicenter of the Black community at that time. Even before the end of the Civil War, the church played a major role in the education of slaves. After the Civil War, many religious denominations went to South to open up training institutes right out of the basement of their churches. Many HBCUs were started in the basement of their churches. That was their very first building. There were two primary respectable careers back in those days, especially right after the end of the Civil War, was you either were a preacher or a teacher. The population of young people was incredible during those times. These one-room schoolhouses needed a credentialed adult in the room to teach them their arithmetic and English and etc. Howard, amongst other HBCUs, were founded for the sole purpose of training ministers, Black ministers and seminarians. That's why many of our leaders during those times were preachers, were ministers.
We use the euphemism Black church, by which we traditionally mean those historical African American denominations. But the Black church itself is very complicated. There's no one size fits all here. Black churches, like white churches, like Asian churches, represent a broad spectrum of attitudes and beliefs and ideas and theologies around LGBT issues.
I was born and raised Roman Catholic. I was born in April, baptized in June. I'm a child of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so there was no vocabulary around this. It was very much trans people as specimens on Phil Donahue.
When I was under a psychiatrist, he said, "You're a transsexual." I said, "Well, what's that?"
That's actually the first time I actually seen a trans person. And I recall feeling like, oh, wow, that's possible. And like, oh, maybe. I asked my mother, I said, "Mommy, have you ever wanted to be a man?" And she said, "Hell no, I never wanted to be a rusty ass man." So that put me back in the closet for many years. That is how I see the transgender experience, is one of transfiguration, in that Jesus himself was transfigured and shown as who he truly is.
We have African American churches that have been at the hallmark, at the forefront of civil rights movements, including LGBT issues. But of course, we acknowledge that there have been churches that have been hostile to persons who are LGBT.
They gathered outside of Cambridge City Hall, more than 200 gay couples who wanted to be first to apply for licenses to legally marry in Massachusetts.
When I was pastoring in Massachusetts at 25, the Supreme Court in Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage. In my immaturity, I was interviewed and I said, "There's no such thing as a gay Christian." I didn't believe you could modify the term Christian with gay because I thought gay was sinful. That's where I stood at 25. Where I stand at 46, I'm much different. And prayerfully, we all have that journey. That's what Paul said, "When I was a child, I thought as a child, I spake as a child." Paul understood that as Christians, we ought to be maturing.
And yet we realize that the role of the state is to protect everyone equally under the law. When I came out in support of marriage equality, there was overwhelming support for the idea that everyone should be treated fairly and equally, and that we could protect religious liberties and individual freedoms at the same time. And the result was that 2012, in terms of growth, was probably the best year in the history of our church. We added 1,000 people that year.
What I see when the church is doing well are people who are loving people and people who've always been loving people. And so we can't pretend that the presence of LGBT persons in the church is something new, something that was invented in 2010 or 2018. There have always been gay folks in churches. There have always been gay men and gay women in churches. There are people who are dying from HIV and AIDS because our churches have failed to respond rapidly to crises in our community.
We wanted to raise awareness about the prevalence of HIV/AIDS in the Black community. You know, it's been a while, but Black people have always been disproportionately affected by that illness. And we as Black folks seem not to talk about that a lot.
We have been behind the curve when it comes to dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis in our society and in the church. I had a family member, a cousin that I grew up seeing as a child. And I noticed when I went to college, I didn't see him anymore. Where's Terrence? I haven't seen Terrence. And over time, you know, I began to hear that he may have HIV. And unfortunately, we did what is in our family, what's often done in many families. We kind of put that person, you know, off to the side. You know, they're like in the back room. I decided today that I would model what it means as a clergy person to break this code in my own family, in our own family, by inviting my cousin Terrence, whom I haven't seen in 22 years, to be with us today. I reached out to him and we flew him here to the church, and he was on the stage. We hugged. He talked about his life.
Some of my friends, they're no longer around. Of course, I moved back home because of the illness.
I talked about missing him. I I lost you. We stopped seeing one another. That was the last time that I recall seeing you.
I didn't understand exactly why you were calling, because actually you hadn't done anything to me. And when I found out that you were a pastor, I said, well, that's the way you're supposed to do.
I'm seeing a great deal of movement in the Black church on the issue of HIV/AIDS. We do free and confidential HIV/AIDS testing here at the church every first Sunday in March. And I constantly encourage our people and let them know if you love yourself, if you care about those that you're intimate with, you want to know your status.
If you're just getting your mind around lesbian and gay, and then trying to get into bisexuality, transgender, man, like by then, it's hard. It's hard to understand someone who says, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body.
They think about people dressing up in someone else's clothes. They don't actually think about the question of identity, the question of people who feel that they were born in the wrong body, the question of people who feel that their fundamental self, who they are, who in fact God has made them to be, is different than the way that they present to the world.
What I want to argue is, maybe you don't have to understand it. Maybe you just need to accept that that person feels that way and let them work that out. Let me tell you a little bit about the transgender Sunday school request. So when the request for the Sunday school class came up, I said, why don't we talk to a few transgender and gay couples within our church and see what they really want? Well, let me tell you what they said. We don't want a gay Sunday school class. We don't want a transgender class. We're not looking to be isolated. We're looking to be included. What we want is to be able to sit in Sunday school class number 12 and be welcomed. And you find a space to let them be who they are.
I don't think it's until you get to know people as individuals and not as issues or an identity category that we're really going to find, movement on this issue.
How many transgender people have you really gotten close to? So before you create policy, get close.
I was married to my husband, who was a pastor, for 47 years, and during the whole time I was considered a first lady. Being a first lady means that a lot of eyes are always on you. You're almost like in a glass house. And people are constantly criticizing and trying to find out what you're doing and how you're doing it. You feel pressure a lot. I have a granddaughter who is transgender, and I have talked to a lot of the people in the church about her journey. So I felt that if I tell her story, that at least it would give them a window into at least one child's experience growing up and transitioning. And I think in a lot of cases it really did open their eyes because they did not have a close-up view. And I sort of see my role as an advocate, and that is kind of spreading her message, and I guess maybe that's for her to do, but I feel like I have to do it as well. We need to become more accepting. We need to become more loving and more caring about this community.
When you get close to people, you see their suffering, you see their humanity, and you maybe even see their divinity.
We have a lot of work to do around issues of human sexuality to kind of really provide people with a broader set of theological and interpretive tools to help wrestle with the issues that we face today. There is a cost to justice work. I mean, anything that I lost pales in comparison to what I have gained. And I think what the church has gained and what our country has gained.
We need more people who are willing to say, I won't abandon the theology I was taught. However, I won't allow that theology to force me to not love people. And when you sit in that space, it can be uncomfortable, but someone has to model how to sit with that space, how to hold on to some old traditions, some old language, and maybe even old theology, but at the same time, be in a space where you're willing to radically love people, where you're willing to take the risk to be an ally, to be an accomplice, to be someone who is speaking out on behalf of the marginalized. James Baldwin, African American author and essayist and novelist, and a gay man. right, grew up in a traditional fundamentalist holiness background. And he says this, he says, if God has any value at all, if this church, if this Bible has any value at all, it is to make us freer and more loving. So if the Bible that Christians affirm today, regardless of where they are, doesn't make us more freeing and more loving today, then I have to question what text they're really reading.
That's the one thing also about being LGBTQ+ in these spaces. It's a benefit because I'm finding that we're becoming more honest with one another and more vulnerable. I had an internship with a lesbian woman out in Bay Ridge, and I worked with the parents. They were like, when we found out that she was a lesbian, we realized that she was not going to be preaching hate from the pulpit. And those are the morals that we want our kids to have. We live with Muslims in this neighborhood. There are all these other people who identify in different ways of being in their gender and sexualities. And we knew that she most likely had to fight for her position to be here, preaching hate. That's not part of her agenda. It's not part of her vocabulary. And I want my kids to grow up knowing that you can live your life not having that in your vocabulary.
So in the Christian tradition, at the end of a church service, usually the pastor or the preacher offers a benediction, right? The benediction is actually not a closing. The benediction is a sending forth. So what if pastors and preachers and ministers and clergy were to take seriously a sending forth? And instead of just closing the service with, okay, go in peace, I'll see you next Sunday, they send people forth to do the work of loving people so radically that the people want to come back again and again and again. That's what we have to do when it concerns our LGBT brothers and sisters. We have to send forth people into communities, into pockets of our society, into the most marginalized spaces, and love people so much that they come back again and again and again.
Once that happens, the social action will catch up to the love.
Try and get people to accept and to love this community and treat them like everybody else is treated.
You may be the change that needs to happen in that particular place.
It's all up to you. We're all called to different spaces.
Your time is not done. God's not through with you yet. You can always serve.